Right at this moment, while you are reading these lines, something is happening that almost no one on Earth knows about. A machine drifting 15 billion miles away from us is still broadcasting back to Earth. The signal is still arriving. The carrier wave is still stable. The machine is still alive. But what it is sending back has no meaning. This is not a case of the signal going silent. This is not a case of contact being lost. The machine is still trying to tell us something important, but the language between it and humanity has broken down. And there is a question that most people have never thought about. What is worse than silence? The answer is this: a machine that is still speaking to you, that you can no longer understand what it is saying. That is exactly what happened on the night of November 14th, 2023. Voyager was not silent. Voyager spoke. And for 5 consecutive months, every word it sent back was meaningless strings of zeros and ones repeating over and over that not a single engineer on this planet could translate. This is the story of Voyager, and this is the part that the headlines do not tell you. It is not only about a chip smaller than a little fingernail that nearly ended a mission nearly half a century old, but about what really happened on the night of November 14th that kept the engineers at the Jet Propulsion Laboratory from being able to sleep. Who was the first person on Earth to read the dead language of this machine again when no one else could? And exactly what the engineers had to sacrifice to save the spacecraft, and why that sacrifice can never be taken back. Stay with me, because by the time this story ends, you will never think about science and knowledge in the same way again. Subscribe right now if you want to hear more stories like this, because we are only just beginning. Let us go back to the beginning. Not the beginning of the machine, but the beginning of the decision that led to this entire story. In a workroom at the Jet Propulsion Laboratory in Pasadena in the 1970s, a group of engineers sat in front of drawings and had to choose the memory technology for the machine they were building. The assigned mission was simple and modest. Fly past Jupiter, fly past Saturn, take some photographs, then drift into space and fall silent. The expected lifespan was 4 years, maybe 5 years, but for the machine to do that, it needed 3 brains. Voyager carried within it 3 separate computers. The first machine was called the Command Computer Subsystem, or CCS, the ears of the machine receiving commands from Earth and carrying them out. The second machine was called the Attitude and Articulation Control Subsystem, or ACS, the neck of the machine, keeping the 3.7-meter antenna pointed precisely toward Earth. If the antenna drifted even a little, the signal would go astray and humanity would lose contact forever. Both of these machines used plated wire memory, a technology that had been tested in previous missions, durable and stable, designed by the generation of engineers from the decade before. The third machine was the computer that this entire story revolves around. It was called the Flight Data Subsystem, or FDS, the mouth of the machine collecting data from 11 instruments on the spacecraft and passing it to the radio transmitter. But this task required much higher speed. The FDS needed to execute 81,000 commands per second, a speed that plated wire memory could not meet. The engineers had to choose a different technology. They chose CMOS RAM, a technology newly invented a few years earlier by the RCA company, one of the first commercial silicon memory chip lines in the world. For the young engineers in the design room at that time, this was the technology of the future. It was smaller, faster, more modern than everything that had existed before it. 3 computers, 2 completely different memory technologies. A decision that no one in the design room at that time could know would mean anything 46 years later. But this was not the first time Voyager would encounter a problem with language. In the middle of 2022, 18 months before the incident that this video is telling, the AACS had begun sending unreadable data back to Earth. Like you receiving mail from the mailman who always greets you every morning, one day he starts speaking a different language. The packages still arrive at the correct address, only the words he speaks no longer have meaning. The JPL team spent 4 months debugging before discovering that Voyager had automatically switched to a backup AACS machine that had been broken for many years. The problem was solved simply. The 2022 AACS was the first sign. Voyager was aging. But no one at that time knew that 18 months later, a far worse incident was waiting, the night of November 14th, 2023. At Pasadena, California, where NASA's Jet Propulsion Laboratory is headquartered, the engineers on the night shift were monitoring the signal arriving from Voyager as they had done every day for the past 46 years. The signal was still arriving, the carrier wave was still stable. The machine was still receiving commands and carrying them out as expected. Pause for a moment to understand what that means. The transmitter on Voyager has only 22.4 watts of power, less than the power of a phone charger plugged into the outlet in your room. From the enormous distance between the machine and Earth, by the time the signal reaches the large antennas of the Deep Space Network, its power has dwindled to only 10 to the minus 16 watts, about 20 billion times smaller than the energy of an electronic wristwatch. But the Deep Space Network caught it. The carrier wave was present. Voyager was still there, still alive, still trying to tell us something. But something was very strange. The data the spacecraft was sending back was not data. It was a string of zeros and ones repeating a meaningless pattern like a telephone stuck on a busy signal. Someone in the control room called this description the dial tone. The line was still connected. You could still hear the sound of the person on the other end. But what you heard was not speech. It was machine noise. The engineers checked again. They ran the decoding tools that had been written specifically for the language Voyager uses, tools that had worked perfectly for nearly half a century. None of the tools worked. They sent a command requesting the spacecraft to switch to backup mode. The spacecraft obeyed the command, but the data was still meaningless. They tried turning the flight data subsystem off and on again, the equivalent of restarting a computer when it malfunctions. Nothing changed. By December 12, 2023, after many weeks of unsuccessful tests, NASA formally announced the incident on its Sunspot blog. The announcement was written in dry, technical language, following the neutral style of American government agencies. But if you read between the lines behind the sentences, you could sense the real anxiety of the people who wrote it. No one knew what was happening. No one knew whether Voyager could recover, and above all, no one knew how to begin. Because this is what you need to understand about this situation. In any ordinary technical problem, the first step when a computer malfunctions is direct diagnosis. You connect to the machine, you read the error logs, you run the tests, you see with your own eyes what is happening inside. With Voyager, none of that is possible. Voyager is 15 billion miles from Earth, impossible to touch, impossible to connect directly, impossible to observe. The only tool you have is the radio signals traveling at the speed of light, and even those signals take 22 hours and 30 minutes to reach the spacecraft. And another 22 hours and 30 minutes for any response to return. 45 hours, nearly 2 full days, for a single exchange. Voyager spoke continuously for many months, but what it said had no meaning, and the engineers on Earth had to relearn the language of the very child they had created 46 years earlier from the farthest distance any dialogue between humans and machines had ever been conducted in history. And they had only 45 hours for each attempt. Now pause and imagine what that process actually looked like, because this is the part that most technical stories skip, but is the heart of what happened during those 5 months. You sit in a control room in Pasadena, you look at a line of meaningless data on the screen in front of you, you read that string of zeros and ones 100 times, 1,000 times, you try to find a pattern, a logical repetition, anything that could be a trace of a system trying to speak. You find nothing. You discuss with colleagues. Someone on the team proposes a hypothesis. Maybe the problem is in the telemetry modulation unit. Maybe that is the final packaging unit before the signal leaves the spacecraft. You agree to try. You write a detailed set of commands designed to test that unit. You check the command set 3 times. You check again a 4th time, because you know that a single wrong command sent to a 46-year-old machine 15 billion miles away could end the mission permanently with no way to recover. You press the send button, the signal leaves the antenna. The signal begins its journey through the space between the stars. You go home, you try to sleep, you return to the control room the next morning, you wait, the day passes, the night passes, the second day begins. At some point on that second day, the response from Voyager arrives. You sit down in front of the screen, you read the response. It is still meaningless data, but this time there is a subtle difference. A small pattern in the string of zeros and ones has changed a little. You are not sure what that means. You write notes, you discuss with colleagues, you form a new hypothesis, you write a new set of commands, you check 3 times, 4 times, you press the send button, you wait nearly 2 more days. You continue this process, day after day, week after week, month after month. November passes, December passes, Christmas passes with your family, but your mind is still in the control room. January passes, February passes, and on every day of those months, you do not know whether Voyager can be saved. You do not know whether you are getting closer to the answer or farther away. You do not know whether your next step is the last meaningful one, because a single wrong command sent out could end everything. You sleep little, you eat at your desk, you argue with colleagues about every smallest detail of every response. You write hundreds of pages of notes trying to map the behavior of a machine whose language you can no longer decode, and you test one hypothesis after another. Is it the Odetics 8-track digital tape recorder that has failed the recording machine that has operated without error for 46 years and may be approaching its limit? You check. It is not. Is it the transmitter? No, the carrier wave is still stable. Is one of the 11 scientific instruments corrupting the main data stream? No, they are operating independently. Every hypothesis that is rejected requires another nearly 2-day waiting cycle. Every no answer pushes you back to the starting point. And every evening when you turn off the lights in the control room and step out into the California night sky, you look up and know that somewhere out there in a space your eyes cannot see, Voyager is still broadcasting, still sending those strings of zeros and ones that you cannot translate, still trying to tell you something, and you cannot understand. This is not ordinary engineering. This is something close to caring for a dying relative in a language you no longer speak. 4 months like that, from November 14th until early March. Not a single clear answer. Not a single real progress. Only the extraordinary patience of a team of engineers that few others on this planet could imagine. Then on March 1st, 2024, the team at the Jet Propulsion Laboratory decided to try something they had never tried before. They sent a command that they internally called a poke. In English, this word means to prod, to poke gently an act of probing that is not violent, but enough to awaken. This was not a precise diagnosis. This was closer to shaking a sleeping person and saying, "Hello, are you still there?" The command was designed to ask the flight data subsystem to try different sequences in its software package going around any part of memory that might be damaged to see whether a meaningful response could be received. The command was sent. The signal began its journey through space. Somewhere out there, Voyager received the command. Voyager executed the command. Voyager emitted a response. The response began its nearly 2-day journey back to Earth. On March 3rd, 2024, the response arrived. And here the story has a moment that very few people outside the mission team know about. Because the first person on Earth to read that response was not a JPL engineer, not Suzanne Dodd, who had managed the Voyager mission since 2010, not Linda Spilker, the project's chief scientist, not Jeff Melstrom, the chief engineer of the Astronomy and Physics division at JPL, who knew the technical details of every chip on the spacecraft. The first person to read Voyager's dead language was an anonymous engineer working for the Deep Space Network, the network of giant radio antennas that NASA uses to communicate with every spacecraft flying past the moon and beyond. The Deep Space Network consists of 3 facilities placed evenly around Earth. One at Goldstone in California, one at Madrid in Spain, one at Canberra in Australia. Each facility has a giant 70-meter diameter antenna large enough to catch the faint signals sent from interstellar space. These 3 facilities are arranged so that as Earth rotates, there is always at least one of the 3 pointing toward Voyager and able to hear the machine's voice. The engineer we are talking about worked at one of those 3 places. This person has never been named in any press release. NASA has not revealed their identity. What we know is that this person sat in front of a screen on March 3rd and recognized something that no one else had recognized. The response from Voyager was not ordinary gibberish. It was a complete record of the entire memory of the flight data subsystem. A complete memory dump. It was not packaged in the correct format. It did not use the standard codes that NASA's decoding tools were waiting for. But if you knew how to read it, if you had enough experience with 1970s computer architecture, then it could actually be translated. And this anonymous engineer was able to. Pause for a moment to imagine that scene. Voyager sends data back to Earth at a rate of only 160 bits per second. This number is so slow that if you wanted to download a 5 gigabyte movie over this connection, you would have to wait 8.5 years. That engineer sat for hours in front of the screen watching each bit slowly arrive from interstellar space, translating them into numbers, arranging the numbers into patterns, recognizing that those patterns were not random data, but the internal record of the very machine that was sending them. Immediately afterward, the memory dump record was transferred to the JPL team. The JPL team sat down and began the detailed analysis process. They compared this dump with dumps stored from before the incident occurred. They searched for differences. They read each line of machine code as if they were reading a notebook written in pencil with pages torn, and after many weeks of analysis, they found it. The hidden truth inside the dead language. Voyager's story could finally be told again. But what they found was not the answer to the problem. It was an even bigger problem. On April 4th, 2024, NASA announced what they had discovered. The cause of the entire incident was a single chip, not the entire flight data subsystem, not the software, not the radio transmitter, not the Odetics tape recorder, not one of the 11 scientific instruments, just one chip, and this is its identity, RCA CD 4061A CMOS SRAM. This was one of the first commercial silicon memory chips ever produced in the world, representing the wave of the semiconductor revolution exploding in the 1970s. Its size is smaller than your little fingernail. Its capacity is exactly 256 bits of data. In 1974, each such chip cost the equivalent of $200 American at today's exchange rate, a significant investment for a piece of silicon so small that you could drop it on the floor and never find it again. The specific chip that failed on Voyager stored 256 words of data, equivalent to about 3% of the total memory of the flight data subsystem. And a single bit inside that chip had become stuck. In computer language, a bit is the smallest unit that can exist. It has exactly 2 values, 0 or 1, corresponding to the 2 electrical states of a tiny silicon cell. This chip had lost the ability to switch between those 2 values. One of its bits was permanently stuck in one of the 2 states, a stuck bit in technical terms. No one knows exactly why. There are 2 main possibilities. The first possibility is that the chip simply aged. 46 years of continuous operation in the harshest environment any artificial object has ever been placed into. The second possibility is that the chip was struck by a high-energy cosmic particle that damaged the silicon structure inside. There is no way to distinguish between these two possibilities. There is no way to know exactly what killed it. And that does not matter, because no one can go there to replace the chip. But the most important detail in this entire discovery is not which chip failed. The most important detail is what the JPL engineers realized when they sat down and looked at the overall architecture of Voyager. The other two computers on the spacecraft, the Command Computer Subsystem and the Attitude and Articulation Control Subsystem, both used plated wire memory. Both were 46 years old. Both had been exposed to exactly the same amount of cosmic radiation. Both had undergone exactly the same extreme temperature cycles between the side facing the sun and the side facing into darkness. Both were still operating normally without any signs of degradation. The AACS had encountered a problem in the middle of 2022, as we said at the beginning of this video, but that was because the software automatically switched to an old broken backup machine, not because a memory chip had died. The plated wire memory chip of the primary AACS remained intact. Only the flight data subsystem died. Only the computer using the most advanced technology of that time died. Only the RCA-CD 4061A CMOS SRAM chip, pioneer of the semiconductor revolution, symbol of the technological future in the eyes of the young engineers in the 1970s, died. While the old plated copper wires designed by engineers of the 1950s continued to store data perfectly, completely unaware of the existence of the semiconductor revolution that came after them, the most advanced died first. The oldest lived the longest. Throughout the entire history of the computer revolution, we have been taught that new technology is always better than old technology, that smaller, faster, more modern is the path of the future, that things designed in the 1950s and 60s would eventually be replaced, would become relics of a past that has passed. Voyager has taught us something different, that the newest is not necessarily the most durable, that sometimes the things built with old technology, with the full caution of people who did not fully trust the new material, last longer than what was built with the technology praised as the next revolution. The RCA-CD 4061A chip in the 1970s was considered a symbol of the future. 46 years later, it was the only component on the entire Voyager that died before the energy ran out. Now comes the part where the entire story shifts from crisis to resolution. But the resolution contains within it a sacrifice that very few technical stories have ever mentioned. The JPL team had identified the chip. They knew exactly which 256 words were damaged and which software code segments had been lost with that chip. The next task seemed simple. Move the lost code segment to a different location in the flight data subsystem memory where the chips were still working, but when they looked at the spacecraft's memory map, they discovered there was no empty block large enough to hold the entire code segment. The total flight data subsystem memory is only about 68 kilobytes, equivalent to a small photo on your smartphone. But this was not the first time the JPL team had faced the problem of memory on Voyager being too tight. In the late 1980s, after Voyager took the historic tiny photograph of Earth and the Moon, the machine's cameras had been permanently turned off, and in the following years, to save memory and power, NASA deleted the entire camera control software from Voyager. The software that taught the machine how to see had been deleted. The machine had once had eyes. It no longer had eyes. Not only because the cameras had been turned off, but because the knowledge that taught it how to see had been erased from its brain. And now in April 2024, the JPL team faced a similar decision, but this time the deletion would hurt much more. Their solution was to divide the lost code segment into smaller pieces, find the scattered empty corners throughout the memory stuff, each piece into a different corner, then rewrite all the cross-references in the entire Voyager software so that when the computer needed a piece, it would know where to look. But when the calculations were finished, they discovered that even doing that was still not enough space. They had to delete old code segments to free up space. Among them were the routines written in the 1970s to control the spacecraft when it flew past Jupiter in March 1979. Those code segments had slept quietly in the memory for more than 45 years untouched. They were memories. They were physical evidence that Voyager once had a different past, that it once visited a giant planet and sent back the first close-up photographs in history, including the image of a volcano erupting on the Moon, Io, the first time humanity had ever seen an active volcano outside Earth. Deleting those code segments meant they disappeared forever. Previously, the camera software was deleted, but the cameras had already been turned off. Deleting the software was only deleting a capability that was no longer used. But deleting the Jupiter code was deleting the memory of an encounter. It was deleting the way this machine once knew another planet. On April 18, 2024, the JPL team sent the first command containing the rewritten code segment. The command left the antenna. No one at JPL could sleep for the 2 days afterward. On April 20th, the response arrived. Suzanne Dodd, Jeff Melstrom, Linda Spilker, and 11 other colleagues, a total of 14 people, sat in a conference room in Pasadena waiting. The screen lit up, the first data arrived. For the first time after 5 months, it had meaning. Voyager was speaking again, clearly, understandably. On the official X account of the mission, a simple line was posted a few hours later. "Hi, it's me, V1. Hello, it is me, Voyager 1. This was the first sentence this machine could say to us after many months of being unable to understand. But to say that sentence, it had to forget its journey through Jupiter. Voyager had cannibalized its own memory in order to continue speaking. But the story does not end at that moment, because there is something that very few people outside the Jet Propulsion Laboratory are talking about. The victory of April 2024 was not the end. It was only a postponement. And inside that postponement is a truth that makes the entire future of Voyager, and perhaps the future of every long-duration space mission of humanity, far more precarious than you might think. This question. Who on Earth can still read the computer language of the flight data subsystem? Not who can read modern programming languages. Who can read exactly the memory architecture designed by engineers in 1974? Who can write a patch in the assembler language used for that computer? Who can run simulations of the flight data subsystem on an emulator computer and know exactly how a new command will work before sending it across the distance of 15 billion miles? The answer, about 14 people. On this entire planet, there are only about 14 people left who still have the ability to work with Voyager's computer language. That is the estimated number from inside the mission team. Suzanne Dodd has been the mission manager since 2010. She has spent most of her career understanding the technical details of a machine designed before she graduated from college. Jeff Melstrom, chief engineer of the Astronomy and Physics division at JPL, knows exactly every chip on the spacecraft, including the CD4061A chip that failed. Linda Spilker, the chief scientist, has worked with Voyager's data across many decades, and about 11 other people, each carrying a portion of knowledge that no document records fully. Edward Stone, the scientist of the Voyager mission from the day of launch until he passed away only a few months after Voyager recovered, once said a sentence that now reads quite differently. "When I look back, I realize we knew very little about the solar system before Voyager. We discovered things that we did not know were there to discover time after time." He departed carrying his portion of knowledge with him. Only 13 people remained. Because this is what the public rarely realizes about the computers designed in the 1970s. They were not programmed in modern languages like Python or JavaScript. They used specialized assembler dialects written for specific architectures. There are no textbooks that teach those dialects. There are no university courses that teach them. They exist only in the heads of the engineers who used them and in dusty technical notebooks stored in filing cabinets at JPL. When those engineers retire, their knowledge of that language largely retires with them. NASA knows this, the Voyager management team knows this. That is why they have deliberately kept the team small, and deliberately not replaced members with younger engineers, because training a new person in the flight data subsystem language would require many years, and there is no curriculum. The flight data subsystem incident of 2023 was not the final incident. It was only the first incident, serious enough to nearly end everything. But there will be more. And each time will be harder than the last because the machine is aging, the distance is growing farther, and the people who can translate the language are growing fewer. But this is the question that no one wants to ask out loud. What happens when those remaining 13 people retire? What happens when they die? Voyager will cross the 1 light day threshold from Earth in November 2026. From that point onward, every command sent out will wait more than 48 hours for a response. The 5-month scenario of this time will be difficult to repeat the next time. If an incident like the night of November 14, 2023 occurs in 2037, when Voyager has long passed the 1 light day threshold, when the plutonium source produces only a fraction of the current 250 watts because it loses 4 watts each year, will there still be anyone on Earth who can translate the machine language to save the spacecraft? The answer may be no. Voyager may die not because its hardware fails, not because its plutonium source is depleted, but because the language it speaks has died in the heads of humanity before the machine itself dies. That is how a machine can fall silent even while it is still speaking. This is what I want you to take away from this entire story, because there is a hidden truth inside the flight data subsystem incident that is very easy to overlook if you only focus on the specific dates and the specific chips and the specific technical decisions. That truth is, knowledge does not live in the machine. Knowledge lives in the people who can read the machine. Voyager has taught us this in the most expensive way. For many consecutive months, from the night of November 14, 2023 until April 20, 2024, this machine was still sending data back to Earth. The signal arrived stably, the carrier wave did not go silent, the machine was still alive. But what it sent back had no meaning, because there was no one who could read it. The chip smaller than your little fingernail had died and taken with it the ability of the entire Earth to understand what Voyager was saying. until 14 engineers sat down and relearned that dead language, rewrote it, and sent the patch across a distance of nearly 2 days. We often think of science as a process of collecting data. We send spacecraft out, they send information back, we analyze. But the flight data subsystem story shows us something deeper. Data is not knowledge. Data is strings of zeros and ones. Knowledge only exists when there is someone who knows how to translate those strings into meaning. If the translator dies, the data still exists, but it returns to gibberish. It speaks without meaning, what is worse than silence. Voyager lost its eyes in the 1990s when the camera control software was deleted. It lost the memory of Jupiter in 2024 when the routines for flying past that giant planet were deleted to make space for the patch. What will it lose next? And at the final loss, will there still be anyone who understands its language well enough to recognize that it has lost something? In November 2026, Voyager will cross the 1 light day threshold from Earth. From that point onward, every command sent out will wait more than 48 hours for a response. The 5-month scenario of this time will be difficult to repeat the next time. And each year that the remaining 13 engineers of the Voyager team grow 1 year older, the window of time in which humanity can still read the language of this machine shrinks further. This is the real story inside the flight data subsystem incident. Not that a chip failed, not that a patch was written, but a moment in the history of humanity when we nearly lost the ability to speak with one of the most important machines we have ever created, not because that machine fell silent, but because we no longer understood its voice. If this kind of story is what you came here to hear, subscribe right now and turn on notifications, because next time we will go deeper into the edge of what humanity can still understand about the universe. Leave a comment about what made you think the most in this video. And share it with someone who needs to be reminded that knowledge is not something that is stored, knowledge is something that is read, and when the reader dies, the data dies with them.